Welcome to the Oriental Institute's Oral History Project. Today is Monday, May 14th, 2018, and we are in Saieh Hall at the University of Chicago. I am Anne Flannery, Head of Museum Archives, and I'm here today with Scalf, Head of Research Archives, Nadine Moeller, Professor of Egyptian Archaeology, and with Knut behind the camera. So we are here today with Janet Johnson, Morton D. Hall Distinguished Service Professor of Egyptology in the Oriental Institute. Professor Johnson received her PhD from the University of Chicago in 1972 and has held professorships here ever since. She was the director of the Oriental Institute from 1983 to 1989 and has published widely on topics ranging from Demotic to Egyptian grammar to women in ancient Egypt, marriage and inheritance, and we'll talk about many more subjects as well today. She has also worked extensively in the field. Thank you for being here and welcome.
My pleasure, thank you.
We're going to get started with just some background questions and questions about your education. So could you give us a little information about your background and how you came to study Egyptology?
I blame it all on my parents. My father was interested in Egyptology, and my mother was interested in South American archaeology, and they brought books home from the library, and I just read everything they brought home from the library. I can remember being in 7th grade and reading, our class used James Henry Breasted's high school textbook, Ancient Times, which was very out of date but very well written. And I can remember telling people at that point that I was going to become an Egyptologist. So it's something in the genes, evidently.
And about how old were you at that time?
Well, that was 7th grade.
Okay.
But this was while I was in grade school as well, that I was reading whatever they brought home from the library. So by the time I was in high school, I knew what I wanted to do.
Was there a time before high school where you kind of fluctuated between?
Not really. I didn't really ever think of anything else.
Okay.
If things had worked out differently and I couldn't do Egyptology, I would have found something else, I presume, but it never came up.
How did your parents react to?
Oh, they were very supportive. They thought I should do whatever I wanted to do, and they encouraged me. My brother was more typical. He said, in a note when I was in college, he said, "Egg pathology, what's that?" But this is my brother who is the button-down fellow. But they were very supportive. And one of the things, your subsequent questions about gender and so on, this is something I never thought of when I was growing up, because my parents encouraged me to do whatever I wanted the same way they encouraged my brother. Mm-hmm. And there was no gender differentiation at all. And I didn't learn about the problems that other women had until I was in college, and I was talking to friends in the dorm, and one friend in particular, whose father was adamantly against her even being in college because she was a woman and it was a waste of time and money. And this is an attitude that I had never run into before.
Yeah. What made you come to the University of Chicago?
Because I could do Egyptology.
Okay. So,
a fellow who was a guidance counselor at my high school has spent a summer in Chicago at the university. And when I said what I wanted to do, he said, "You've got to go to Chicago because they have an undergraduate program."
Did you even look anywhere else, or did you only apply to Chicago?
Well, I think I also applied to some safety valve, good small liberal arts colleges where I wouldn't have done Egyptology, but I would have gotten a decent education, and that could have gone, as most of our students do, something other than that as undergraduates and then started as graduate students. But I was very lucky that I could come here and get started early.
And where did you grow up? So
I was born and raised near Seattle, and when I was 13, we moved to the Denver area.
Okay. So was coming to Chicago sort of an exciting adventure, or was there any anxiety surrounding?
No, I didn't know enough about the city to be worried.
Egyptology focused.
Exactly. We got here, and orientation in the dorm said, don't walk around at night by yourself, always take a friend with you. And so, all right. But I mean, I grew up in a very safe, positive environment. I was very lucky.
And your time as an undergraduate studying Egyptology, how did you find the University of Chicago's Common Core, or your experience as an undergraduate?
I liked the Common Core. I didn't like every single course in the Common Core, but I liked the idea of the Common Core. And I had a couple of other friends who were undergraduates who were also doing Egyptology, so it wasn't as weird as it could have been otherwise.
So you really found your niche.
Yeah, and as is, I think, fairly typical in undergraduate life, I knew all the people in my dormitory and all the people in my classes, but I knew very few other people. But it was in the days of the band playing at halftime on the football clubs, football games, and so on. So there were a lot of activities going on. And I can remember walking across campus on a Saturday afternoon, the first year I was in the college, and thinking to myself, this is me, this is what I want to be. I want to be walking to the library on a Saturday afternoon and enjoying myself.
So you really were like drawn to that intellectual atmosphere.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the reading and the thinking about other things and trying to put A and B together to get more than A plus B.
Were there any classmates that also became professionals in the field that were undergraduates with you?
No, there were a couple of women who did their degrees, but they didn't ever become professionals. There's not the opportunity for most people. So.
And when deciding to go to graduate school, which seems like that was a clear path
Yeah.
for you, was there any other option besides Chicago?
Well, actually, the reason I stayed in Chicago was that I've been in the right place at the right time. There were 2 changes of faculty at the U of C that particular year. And so I had more new faculty by staying here than by going anyplace else where there'd be only one faculty member. And so it made perfect sense to stay here.
So what was that? Who was involved in those changes?
Crossbear and Ed Wenting were replacing John Wilson and Keith Seeley.
Okay.
And George Hughes, of course, was coming back from Chicago.
Can you tell us a little bit about starting graduate school and professors that you worked with and who had a...
Well, I've just mentioned the names of most of them. The strictly Egyptological faculty were Crossbear, Ed Wenting, and George Hughes. And George had been the director of Chicago House for many years and came back and was director of the OI, but he also did some teaching, and I was lucky enough to study with him. He was the director of my dissertation. Helene Cantor was the archaeologist. I took classes with various other people, like Tony Brinkman and so on, but they were less directly involved in my graduate work.
And you went through your graduate work very quickly, is that right?
Because I had done the first 2 years as an undergraduate,
Okay.
so that I got through in 5 years, but 5 plus 2, so I mean it was a more normal length of time, but I had done 2 of it as an undergraduate.
Okay.
But yeah, I was able to take my so-called 4-year exams at the end of 2 years because I had done 2 years as an undergraduate. So then I was ahead of the game at that point. Then I was able to get some field experience at Hierakonpolis and at Jarvanava.
And sort of deciding what to write your dissertation on, was that a clear path, or was that something
The
you
choice to
struggled
do
with?
Demotic was a premeditated choice.
Okay.
One of my field experiences was working at Hierakonpolis on late pre-dynastic materials, which was one of my 2 loves. And my other love was I simply liked working with documents that had to do with real people in real life. And I said to myself, if I can handle Demotic, I'm going to do a dissertation on Demotic because there's so much unpublished material that deals with real life individuals. I found that I wasn't the world's greatest demotivist, but I could handle it. And I'm organized enough that I could put together theories and organize stuff and so on. So I ended up doing a dissertation on Demotic grammar, which takes advantage of the organization aspect.
And at that time, there were not that many people working on Demotic.
No, there were here in that George was, Charlie Nims, who had taken over as director of Chicago House, but was here in the summers, was. Edgerton had been, but he was long gone. But there was a tradition here of doing Demotic.
Was there any contact at that time with anybody, let's say in Europe, who was specializing in Demotic, or was it just kind of?
I was very lucky again. Karl Theosopsis organized the first international meeting of Demotists and invited George Hughes. And George wrote back and said, can I bring my young colleague? And so I got to go to the first one of those. And so I met many of the Europeans then for the first time. And it was a small group. That first meeting was probably 20 people. And it's now, what, 200 people?
Yeah.
What year was that?
I don't remember. I'm not too good on dates.
That's fair. But right when you finished, you transitioned into a professorship here.
Yeah.
And
And once again, I was in the right place at the right time because George was retiring and they wanted to maintain Demotic studies if they could. And I was told, I presume accurately, that it was a choice between me and a woman who was finishing her degree on the East Coast of the 90s because I did Demotic and they knew me, they chose me.
And can you tell us a little bit about what that transition was like? From
It was
going
weird.
from undergrad to graduate to professor?
It was strange because I had a normal student relationship with my faculty and with the other faculty. And I maintained that for a certain length of time, but eventually people started saying, come on. And George Hughes' wife, Maureen, one summer we were, the woman who was at that time the administrative assistant to the director, had a beach house in Michigan, and she invited people out for summer parties. And I was helping serve drinks at one of these parties, and Maureen Hughes, I said, Mrs. Hughes, what would you like? And she said, I'll have tea and my name is Maureen. and this was sort of the catalyst for me to switch gears.
Was there a lot of competition among the students when you're going through
Yes.
graduate school?
Yes. I was in a group of people who we had like 7 very good students. I was a year younger than they were, but I ended up in classes with them, and then I ended up in classes with the students the year behind, because I was the only student my year. But I worked with the older and the younger students. And people like David Silverman and Jim Allen, who are very successful Egyptologists. So it was a very stimulating atmosphere to work in. But there was a fair amount of competition, most of it healthy competition, sort of not attacking each other, but trying to one-up each other and so on. But most of us had slightly different interests, and so we weren't in direct competition with each other, but we challenged each other to do the best that we could. But we've also had, since I've been on the faculty, there have been times when the competition among students has gotten out of hand.
Sure.
We've had to try to regulate.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, just from my opinion, that lately, that it's the relationship between the graduate students has been very good
Yes.
in the last 5
It
10
seems
years
so
or
to me. Yeah.
Which is different than the stories
Yes.
that like my generation and later have heard about earlier times. I'm also kind of curious, and this sort of segs into the next question a little bit here, is I've also heard stories about, it seemed like your experience was maybe almost unique with sort of just how it all worked out, but also not facing any of these sort of discrimination or hardships. But I've heard other women Egyptologists from our program and the distant past had rougher times with certain professors.
I've heard stories, someone like Miriam Lichtheim, who filled in for Edgerton when he was on leave, and when he returned she was just summarily dumped and went back to school and trained as a librarian and became a very, very fine librarian and published one of the translation volumes that's most used by students today. But there have been other women who certainly did face discrimination. And as I said, I for the most part wasn't even aware of this kind of discrimination. And if I'd run up against it, I might become more aware. But the people I was working with, gender didn't seem to have any roles
It's
in
amazing,
what was
yeah.
going on.
Yeah, I mean, considering you're in this competitive class atmosphere with these other pretty much all men or mostly men?
Mostly men.
Your professors are all mostly men. You know, who knows? You know, what
But, I mean,
everybody probably had different
we
relationships with
can
them.
we can set up various stereotypes because most of the Egyptology faculty before me were also ministers,
Hmm.
and there wasn't any discrimination on that grounds either. They were. John Wilson was said to be to not write letters of recommendation for students to go to Princeton because that's where he graduated, and he didn't think anybody was good enough to go where he graduated. I don't know that this was true in the slightest because it was only stories told about him,
Right. Right.
and I have a great deal of concern about whether they're an accurate reflection of what was going on. I liked John Wilson. He was a very fine man. He was a wonderful teacher. I took Old Egyptian with him, and he had a photographic memory. And you'd get to a point in a text, and you could see him. You'd stare at the ceiling and read through something until he got to the right page and tell you what it was. But he was a very, very kind man, and he demanded a lot, but he gave a lot as well. And he also had a house on Harper Avenue where all the trick-or-treaters go on Halloween, and he dressed up as a cowboy usually. And
So you're maintaining traditions.
we're maintaining traditions.
Interesting choice. So if, not to dwell on obstacles, but if you didn't feel that gender obstacles were a serious issue going through your career, what sort of obstacles, if any, did you find or struggle with while trying to rise through graduate school into the professorial life?
One of the things as I said, my first acquaintance with gender problems was in college when I met these women who were sort of fighting their own families and so on. When I became a junior member of the faculty, I was appointed over the first 5 years or so to a number of university-wide committees, which I think happens to most junior faculty. And I ran up against my own first gender problems because I'd say something in a committee meeting, nobody would say a word. 5 minutes later, a man would say the same thing, and they'd all say, "Oh, very good point." Mm-hmm. And after this happened about 5 times, I realized what was going on.
Right.
But there was no institutional way to deal with it, because I once tried to talk with one of the chairman of one of these committees. He said, "Oh no, you're imagining it. That's not really happening." Right? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think things like that have, because of enough people bringing them up and complaining about them, things like that are now much more in people's consciousness, and you can't get away with it the way you could then.
And during the 70s, things were changing. Hanna Gray just came out with a memoir.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it yet.
We're kind of curious if her presence in the administration and faculty kind of started to shift things, or as much as you can answer a question like that, but if there were any sort of...
I'm going to say something that's going to sound nasty and sexist, and I don't mean either of those things. When I was director, she was the president, and she had a monthly meeting of all of the deans, and the director of the OI is at the level of a dean. Mm-hmm. And I saw her handling these meetings, and I think one of the reasons that she was so successful was that she acted as if she were a male director. She didn't take any guff. She stood her ground. She took control of the meeting. She knew what she wanted, and she got what she wanted. And I think that in a way, having women like that who did things according to the way you're supposed to do them is part of what opened things up, because suddenly men realized that there were women who were doing things according to the rules, the men's rules, but nevertheless according to the rules.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, this is also sort of hearsay and apocryphal, but she received backlash for that sort of behavior as well.
I imagine she did,
right?
because there were people who didn't expect her to do that, and so on.
You know, things like that. So it's interesting how that opens doors, but then there's
yeah, you can probably get some backlash. I didn't ever know her well, and so I never talked with her about anything like that. But,
It's just interesting because it sounds like what I'm hearing from your experience is that this is more sort of a sign of the times than it was anything in your sort of conscious decision making about.
I made no conscious decisions. Recently, I have been proactive and tried to do things on behalf of women and so on. And I've done a lot of work on gender studies in ancient Egypt in the last, 10, 15 years. But it was not a conscious choice on my part when I was young to be holding a flag or doing anything of the sort. And I don't know, Hannah, but I have a feeling that it might be the same with her, that she was simply a very competent woman who was selected to carry out a job that she was very capable of doing. And the fact that she did it irritated some people, and so she got some backlash. But it also made it possible for more people to.
Absolutely. So at what point, you were mentioning the last 10 to 15 years, but at what point did you feel that maybe opening more doors to women in the field or any sort of activism in that way was something you were interested in or necessary?
It was slow, but I think as I got to the point where I had a little bit of clout, I realized that I could use my clout in ways that would help other people, and one of the groups of others was women.
And can you mention a couple ways in which you decided to take that action? Or?
I think pushing for women faculty appointments, pushing for inclusion of women in professional organization directorships and boards of governors and so on, where if you have a choice between a competent man and a competent woman, go for the woman to bring in a new voice. It was a change of my behavior from not thinking about it at all to thinking about, well, if you can make a difference, try.
Right. And I would imagine also sort of these very small behaviors, like you were mentioning being in a room and having to say something 5 times, and then it's only heard when a man says it, but even those things shift the tide very much by supporting.
And as you get more and more women who are capable and can hold their own in a masculine-based situation, then they can start shifting the assumptions so that it's not only women who act like men, but women who act like women can be included in decision-making and so on.
So it's so fascinating because it's almost like you want to get everyone back to where you started, so that we're all just not thinking about it.
Yes, exactly.
You have to go through this whole process so that we can all get back to the point where it's just like, are they good at this or not?
Exactly.
Doesn't matter all these superficial characteristics.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. I would love, as we sort of turn to what you've done in your research life, but there's a great story that I'd love to get captured here. And if you don't want to tell it, you don't have to tell it. But it's not a bad story or anything. But there's a great story about your dissertation defense.
Ah, yes.
And this tradition here, especially for Egyptologists, of having to sight read for everyone. And I'm just wondering if you could give us an account of that.
Yes. I brought this up most recently at the last dissertation defense I was at. George Hughes was my major sponsor, and he wanted to show off how good I was because I had just been hired by the faculty, and so he wanted everybody to see how wonderful I was. I unfortunately disappointed him, but nevertheless, for the reading portion, I wrote my dissertation on the grammar of 2 Ptolemaic and Roman long texts and study of the verb forms and so on. His specialization was on earlier Saieh materials. So to show off how wonderful I was, he brought in a text, P. Ryland's 9 Pedieza, which is a long 20-some column text written in Saieh period handwriting, which is very cursive and very different from the Ptolemaic and Roman handwriting that I had been working on. And so we got to that part of the dissertation defense, and he brought this out and he said, okay, you talk about second tenses, or I don't remember what particular grammatical construction was, but read this and tell us how this is pertinent. And I'm sitting there going, So George gets up and goes to the blackboard And he transcribes the Saieh period Demotic into Roman period Demotic. I said, oh, blah, 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 and this shows us this. It was the handwriting, which messed me up.
Which even just that idea, like you just stand up, here, let me do it for you, and then he's got it all in his head is,
Yes.
Amazing.
He was an amazing man. But there was a party that evening for me, as there frequently is, and Hans Gustav Gudebach, who had been at the Dissertation defense, came with a little gift, and he said, this is to try to make up for this afternoon.
What was that?
At this point, I don't remember, but it was just the thought that it was.
That's funny.
It was clear to everybody that it was a lousy performance, but.
Do you think, having gone through an experience like that, do you like that we have still sort of maintained that tradition and that part of the dissertation defense, sort of forcing people to do that?
Yeah, I do actually. We talked about it, as I said, at the last dissertation defense that I was at. It's very Germanic, but our tradition is studied with Ehrman and so on, and it's a very Germanic program. So that part of it doesn't bother me, but I sort of like the idea that you're expected to be able to handle this, and it's not necessarily completely sight reading. You don't know ahead of time what you're going to get, but I don't remember what you got.
I got Bid Nat 149, the Palmontes, Book of the Dead, and other stuff in Demotic, which of course I had read a lot for writing the dissertation, so it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't something I had never seen, but I mean, I guess I had always thought about it as, I assumed that the faculty wanted to make sure you hadn't lost this ability over all those years of taking no classes and just going and writing, because you could sort of just rely on additions.
I think that happens on occasion, and a recent one, the student was given something that she had actually published 7 or 8 years ago, and she hadn't looked at it since. And she recognized what the text was, but she couldn't remember all of the details of it. But it can embarrass the student, and it can embarrass the faculty member who's produced the text. But I think in theory it's okay.
Yeah, it's sort of a fair test.
Well, it's just an aside, like it sort of has a laboratory quality to it. You can think of it as a test that you pass or fail, but it's also sort of an experiment and getting comfortable perhaps with failing on your feet. And then
and how do you react and so on.
Exactly. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, since you've been on the faculty so long, here's a question about that, just something that came to mind. Do you think it's ever been used as a last hazing ritual?
I won't say it's been used that way, but Klaus Baer used to refer to it as that.
Okay. Yeah, sort of that last,
It's our last chance to get the student.
A little bit, yeah.
And I don't know that he ever actually did that.
Yeah.
But it certainly is perceived that way.
Yeah, I mean, most of the ones that I've seen, the text that have been chosen is something that you've worked on a lot. So.
Yeah. And nobody's been failed.
Nobody's been failed.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, you talked a little bit already about you were just in the right place at the right time for studying Demotic. Not a lot of people were doing it, but there were people in Chicago that were doing it, and they sort of was needed and also an interesting intellectual challenge. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, because the Demotic Dictionary has been such a huge part of your career, if you could just talk about how that coalesces here in Chicago, because it was sort of already here, right? I mean, the idea for it was...
Edgerton had at one point gone to Germany and studied with Spiegelberg, and Spiegelberg left his files to the Oriental Institute. So shortly after I joined the faculty, I decided what we should do was organize that material, see what we had, and see what we could do with it. And it included some dictionary files from Spiegelberg, and it included Spiegelberg's notes of materials in various museums, his preliminary drafts of translations of texts that he published, and so on. And so Mark Smith, who is well known to Egyptologists and Demetists, was an undergraduate and then a graduate student here, and he and I went through and organized the files and made lists of what was there and made cards for every text for which we had a translation and so on. And as a result of that, realized that we could actually try to do something. The whole genesis of the dictionary was predicated on George Hughes, however, because he was here. He said he would support it, he would help me with it. And I would never have started it if he hadn't been here and been willing and able to answer any question that I came up with. Because I knew that if I didn't know, and there were a lot of things I didn't know and still don't know, he was there and he would help. And so that made it possible for me to commit myself to doing it.
What was the relationship there? I was sort of surprised. Was Edgerton and Spiegelberg just particularly close? I mean, what?
I think
What was the
Edgerton may have been his
motivation?
last student.
Okay.
I'm not certain on that, but it's possible.
Because there's other, aren't there other Spiegelberg papers in other institutions?
I imagine so, yes.
Yeah, because it seems like we got a certain amount of
We got-
material, but you don't have like a bunch of personal correspondence and
Oh,
things
we
like
do
that.
have some personal
Okay.
correspondence, but it's mostly personal correspondence about particular papyri
Mhm.
for which we have the documentation.
Mhm. I see. Interesting. And then, was NIMS involved in the early dictionary at all? I thought for some reason
He had
published-
talked about doing something,
Yeah.
but he actually gave a paper
This is
at
what I'm
an
thinking of.
international meeting
Yeah.
in Paris, in which he said that he would like to do something, but he never.
So it was just the idea
It was the
was sort
idea
of
of it,
floating around.
and I went and talked with him about it because I didn't want to take something away from somebody. And he encouraged me to go ahead,
Mhm.
because he was director of Chicago House and was here only a short time in the summer, and he said, I'm just not gonna have time to do it.
Right. And then I guess the next big, I should say, so you have this Spiegelberg Nachlass material, but then Hughes leaves all of his material also to the dictionary,
Sure.
correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He left his files, his books, and so on. So we have in the dictionary office, we have books from Spiegelberg that came by his Nachlass. We have photographs from Spiegelberg, and then we have all of George Hughes's library
Mhm.
and his notes and so on.
So something like, just as an example, I'm curious about like the Thompson dictionary, that the sort of
Mhm.
early dictionary that Herbert Thompson put together, never was published,
No,
and I think you only have it on some kind of
we have a very early pre-Xerox
Yeah.
copy
what
of
those stat. I don't know.
Stat, yeah.
I don't know what these
Some
were. And did that come through Spiegelberg or Hughes or?
that must have come through Edgerton, I would think.
Oh, okay, yeah, because that was been very early. All
It
right.
was very early, yeah.
So you get this started. You have sort of Hughes's support and blessing and help
Yes.
to get this up and running. But from my understanding, pretty early on, you got a lot of other scholars involved, like Zalzish and sort of these
We
international
got some
folks.
money from NEH, and one of the things in there was to bring in visiting scholars for a month at a time. And so we had people like Krolter, Zalzish, we had Ron Williams from
Mhm.
Toronto. Yeah, we were lucky, and again, these were people. The field was small enough that one could identify the people who would be able to come in and jumpstart things. And the two of them were people who were, I myself am a person who organizes. And so I can take somebody else's publication and categorize the grammar and make sense of this and that. I don't have the eye for reading the Demotic. And so what I wanted to do was to get people like that who could come in and really make sure that we were doing right by the actual Demotic itself.
Sure. And did you have, I mean, you had a lot of models, obviously, for the project. Were you sort of consciously borrowing, let's say, how the CAD ran, the Chicago Syrian Dictionary ran?
I talked with the
or-
CAD people, I talked with the Hittite people, I talked with a couple of dictionary projects elsewhere. I was also consciously trying to imitate the Demotic glossar, so that people, which is a volume published by a man named Erickson in the mid-1950s, where he pulled together everything that was known at that point. And I was trying to imitate copy the way he organized things so that people who were used to using his glossar would sort of have an innate understanding of how our dictionary worked. So that was one of the major things was to try to, I mean, we add more details than he did. I mean, we have a lot more examples in compounds and idioms and so on. But the general layout and the general contents are based on the Eric's.
And the sort of methodology was, I don't know, it might seem like common sense, I don't know, maybe to us, people who are involved in it, but it's go through, make cards for every word, file them, bring in these international experts to do some of the stuff that maybe we don't have the expertise here for, and then sort of build up this, we might call a database on cards. And I think you guys were doing, what, the stuff from, whatever, 54 to 79?
The glossar was published in 1954, so we said that we were going to do 1955 through 1979, which was a 25-year period. Based on the fact that when that glossar came out, it spurred a lot of work in Demotic because now people had a reference tool that they could use to help them with their publications. And there was a huge amount of publication of new texts in that 25-year period. And so we said, what we'll try to do is incorporate the stuff from that 25-year period and make it available. That part we didn't quite get done, but that was the point of it, was to take advantage of that burst of creative energy that came with the publication of the glossar.
Sure. And so those early years, you know, for people of my generation, when you think about it, you know, I've talked with you personally about this, and you think about Salzish coming over and working here, Mark Smith working in the dictionary next to Robert Rittner, next to Richard Jazz, now like all of these people who went on to have very big careers and do really, really good work in Demotic in particular, but also in Egyptology. You know, maybe I'm romanticizing it a little bit in my mind, but I think about it as it must have been sort of really exciting.
It was.
You know?
To be able to go to any of those people on any given day and ask a question and say, what are we doing with this? This doesn't seem to work this way. Is there some other way we can deal with it? And to have those guys come up with ideas, it was exciting. And to be able to do this on a day-to-day basis was very exciting.
So it was, you could tell then, it's not something that's just in retrospect, like at the time it was sort of intellectually, you know, sparky.
It was, but it was also drudge work at the same time.
Sure.
Because 95 words out of 100, there wasn't anything very interesting about them, but you still had to make the cards and you had to record them and so on. But yeah, there was always the chance that somebody would come up with something that would spark a conversation that would be very, very exciting.
Is there any particular person who was known for making the most cards for the dictionary?
Most cards. I never thought about that.
I'm just curious. The OED, you know, has this famous story about this guy who's, you know, in mental hospital.
Oh,
making all
yes,
these
that's right. I'd
references.
forgotten that.
I'm just wondering if there was like one particular person who was the best at the drudge work, making all the dictionary cards, you know. But
I didn't pinpoint anybody who was especially good at making cards. I mean, everybody did their cards.
yeah. It's
If you
interesting.
wanted to name that person today, give them the...
No, it was just, it just came into my mind. I was just sort of curious. I mean, you can see how a project like this would work, and it's possible that one person was just, like you're good at the sort of organizing, maybe one person was really good at just sitting down and plowing through.
What happened in most cases was that a person would start out by making cards based on transliterations and translations made by one of the older students. And then as the older students moved out of the picture because they finished and went off to jobs, the younger students would move into that role, so that in the course of their time on the dictionary, as you sort of know, you went through several different stages of things, and some people really shone at the early stages where they were putting things together, and other people shone more at the stage where they were being asked to help clarify something.
Sure. When did you guys stop making paper cards? Did you just, so you were looking at the text between 55 and 79, presumably you made cards for all of those.
Yes.
Then of course you have incorporated stuff after
We
that.
have incorporated a lot of stuff from the 80s and less stuff ever since, so that we have We're semi-complete on major publications for the 80s into the 90s, but since the change of millennia, we have something that interested one of us that we went ahead and did, or something that someone published and sent us the equivalent of cards
Right.
for it.
So there's stuff there then in the version of the dictionary now that's not represented by paper cards. Is that true or not true?
Yes, I'm sure it's true.
Like stuff that you're sort of incorporating now, nobody's making
Yes.
a card for, right?
Right.
And putting it back into the files.
We stopped modifying the records about a year ago, and we're doing all sorts of conversion stuff. This is the third major conversion we've had to do because of the change in computers. And we have to, because Microsoft changed the way they handle images, we have to redo all 40,000 of our images. And we are converting to a different program for displaying, all of which is taking everybody's time at this point. So the students who are working now are just doing this really boring work of converting something that somebody else worked on. And so we haven't done any changes to content. We've corrected typos and stuff, but that's all. But until that point, for probably the last 5 years, there were a lot of things that we just added directly into the dictionary files themselves rather than making cards.
Was when you started the project in '79, I guess, is that when it started? What was the role of technology then? I mean, you know, you were very early with using scans, with using word processing programs to put all this stuff together.
Once again, I was in the right place at the right time. We started compiling our 3x5 cards, and we're just getting to the point where we were going to start trying to put together a first draft. And I'd been thinking of how to do it, and we were talking about making hand copies of all these words and so on. And Macintosh came out with their scanners, and they had a computer fair on campus. And Don said, let's go. And we went there, and they had a door prize and a scanner. And Don said, sign up for it. So I did, and I won it.
Oh, that is incredible.
That is an incredible story.
Because I'm sure at that time it was like really, really expensive.
Yeah, and we realized that we could do all of these scans electronically. And the nightmare I had was you have a piece of paper with 15 little tiny pieces of paper pasted onto it. At least 5 of them are going to get put in the wrong place and so on, or just fall off completely or so on. And this just took away that whole problem.
Wow, serendipity.
Oh yeah,
Your whole career.
absolutely. And the people in Michigan who were working on the papyrus collection there came to see what we were doing, and I showed them what we were doing with the scanners, and they went home and bought scanners and did the Michigan stuff the same way.
Wow, that's unbelievable. In that regard, I'm actually very curious about this, either technology-wise or otherwise. You've spent most of your career, all of your career, basically, with all your professional career with the Demotic dictionary and sort of there, and you've dedicated tons of time and resources to it. Would you do anything differently now with making that kind of major sacrifice?
I don't think I would think of it as a sacrifice. Producing a research tool which colleagues can use and benefit from is, to me, very rewarding.
Do you wish you did it on paper before the computers ruined all your conversions?
Computers are wonderful and terrible, and they're probably always going to be that way. We can do so much with them, but then they take over and rule what we can do as well. And would I have organized things exactly this way if I weren't using computers? Probably not. Would that have been any better? Probably not, just different. And the amount that we can do and the speed with which we can do it are so much greater with the computers, and the accuracy and the ability to share with colleagues and so on. We've had PDFs of individual letters up online for 15 years, which meant that anybody in the world who had the slightest desire to look up the word elephant in Egypt, in Demotic, could do so. That's the kind of thing which, to me, that's part of what scholarship is about, is not just my own scholarship, but encouraging other people to do scholarship. In addition to which, I don't feel that I have neglected my own personal research. I've done research on Demotic, I've done research on Egyptian grammar in general, and in recent years I've done a fair amount of work on gender studies. I've had a chance to do my own work and make my own name aside from the dictionary, so I don't think I've lost anything. I think I've gained everything.
Yeah. I just know how, a lot of professional scholars would see that burden, and they would think, oh, I have all these other projects that I wanted to do and all these books I wanted to write or whatever it was, and they could see that as really taking time away from that. But I think that's a positive way to look at it.
I don't see that. I think if I want to make a name for myself, if that's what I'm most interested in, I probably am doing it more by having the dictionary as editor of the dictionary than my individual research. One individual's individual research is not usually that crucial.
Yeah, sure.
And as you're saying, scholarship is about seeing what other people can't see, and these dictionaries or these resources are really the framework underneath so much scholarship that other people don't normally recognize that are essential.
Yeah. And being able to have a colleague say to me, I went to volume X and found what I was looking for and it really made a difference. To me, that's the greatest recognition that I could ask for.
So, let's talk a little bit about fieldwork.
Yes.
Because apart from being mainly interested in text and grammar and all your experience as a philologist, you also participated in several fieldwork projects. So can you tell us a little bit about that and motivations behind all this?
As a graduate student, I had the opportunity to work at the site of Hierakonpolis, which is a late prehistoric site of very great importance. It was very exciting. I was there a year where we actually excavated the remains of an early palace. It was very exciting. And it reaffirmed for me the importance for an Egyptologist to understand not only the texts and the history, but the archaeology and what archaeology has to offer in terms of understanding the development of Egyptian history and culture, what archaeologists can and can't do, just as what text people can and can't do. And the faculty here, in my time at least, have always encouraged language people, history people, to get field experience so they have some appreciation of what their colleagues are doing, and encouraged archaeologists to get the basic language and history so that, again, they know what can and can't be done, and the field can work together as a whole. And the second year, the Hierakonpolis excavations were canceled for political reasons. And I ended up working with Lanny Bell doing epigraphy in the tombs at Drabunaga.
Oh.
And we were also cleaning out one of the tomb shafts. But I was basically working on the epigraphy. But again, we were working in Drabunaga. We were living in the Theban area, and it was reinforcing how much the material culture has to be understood together with the texts, and the fact that the texts themselves are archaeological objects, if you think back far enough, and should be understood in that context and not just independently for themselves, because you lose something that way. Then I had the good fortune of marrying a field archaeologist, which reinvigorated. And we did work on the Red Sea coast, working on a site that was Roman for me and early Islamic for him. I thoroughly enjoyed the chance of being in the field, working with objects, trying to make sense out of pottery shapes and so on, trying to put things together in a way that was different from working on texts. And we found one Demotic ostracon.
Yeah,
But I think it's very good for everyone to have a feel for the whole aspect of the field of Egyptology and not just
yeah.
one particular.
Couldn't agree more, yeah, exactly. So interesting though, since there was Chicago House and the Epigraphic Survey, was the Darwin project related to the
No.
Epigraphic Survey?
No.
So how come you actually never...
Because I was a
worked there?
woman.
Oh. So.
That's the one place where I directly was discriminated against.
Incredible.
They would not take an unmarried woman on the staff because she might lead astray the men on the staff.
That is incredible. And I've actually seen you and Dawn on pictures in the hall in Chicago House, I mean in one of the hallways. So how did you get on that picture?
Oh,
Because
well,
there was like
we-
all of Chicago House team has this like once a year photograph. And
We-
I definitely saw you on it.
We stayed at Chicago House when we were working in Luxor Temple.
Aha.
Don and I did a season or two clearing. The department had cleared off a lot of the rubble inside the temple, but there was one embankment that had not been cleared out right behind what used to be called the old Coptic houses.
Oh,
And
right.
we excavated part of that down to the Nectanegel levels. And we stayed at Chicago House while we were there. But I've stayed at Chicago House and we
Yeah.
stayed there. We used that as our retreat
Uh-huh.
when we were working on the Red Sea coast. We would stay
Yeah.
there as we were going in and going out, and then on Friday afternoon, two people would drive back to Chicago House for R&R and to buy supplies and so on.
So you had an interest to go there, and it was
That's right.
interesting.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Yes.
Especially
very-
with Hughes being your main advisor. I'm surprised that was where you faced this issue.
Yeah.
This was a decision made, I assume, by the NIMSs,
Mhm.
that there were, it was referred to as the Presbyterian manse. It was a very restricted social environment, and they simply didn't want any unattached women running around. I got along perfectly well with both Myrtle and Charlie, but
Mhm.
they simply didn't want any unattached women. I think the only woman who had been there without being married was Carolyn Ransom Williams in the 40s.
Yeah, because she didn't get married until much later, so she would have
Mhm.
had to have been there.
What about the lady who wrote this amazing book on the Stephen Necropolis royalties? She was, I looked her up, Elizabeth Thomas,
Yes.
because she was big friends with the Nimses, and there are pictures of her at Chicago
I
House.
don't know whether she actually stayed at Chicago
Oh.
House or not. I'm not saying she didn't, I just
Yeah.
don't know.
Interesting. Well, actually, another question. What about working conditions on site at the time? So Heracropolis, that must have been with Fair Service?
With Fair Service.
So can you tell us a little bit about
And Kent
how
Weeks
you-
was the assistant director.
Okay.
Kent's wife, Sue, was there.
Mm-hmm.
We were living on the Fustat, which is a boat which was moored about 20 minutes walk from the site. John Wilson was the Egyptological sponsor, and he came for about a week in the middle of the season, which was good. He went swimming off the edge of the boat. But there was a woman who was the registrar, and there was a woman who was the conservator. So I wasn't the only.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, no problem on the
There
houseboat.
was no problem on the houseboat.
Yeah.
And I didn't recognize any problem in dealing with workmen.
Mm-hmm.
I never had any particular problems with getting them to do what I wanted. I knew, at that point, I knew enough Arabic to be able to communicate fairly well. I don't anymore.
When you were working with Dawn at Corsair, what was your what were your tasks on that excavation?
I was the registrar. I excavated,
Uh-huh.
and I was the registrar, and I was the accountant.
Great.
He was in charge of directing excavations and telling people what to do and helping them figure out how to do it and so on. And he assigned me field tests as well. But
Cool. Well,
What was like when you guys were digging there? What was so you were living in you're sort of working from the boat when you were at the other
at
exhibition.
Tierra yeah.
When you guys
At
were out on
Crusair-
the Red Sea,
At Crusair, we actually lived in the old phosphate factory.
Wow.
There was the phosphate company was no longer what it had been. I mean, there still were men working. Many of our workmen actually were phosphate workers. They were very good diggers because they were used to digging phosphate, and they knew how to handle their tools and so on. But there was this compound with the headquarters house, and then a series of places for people to sleep, and then there was a Coptic church, and so on, and a big parade ground. And so we were living in 2 or 3 of the houses, and the cooks in the main house were our cooks. And it was very comfortable. We even had hot water, as I recall.
Well, food must have been interesting because I guess you couldn't buy many, I mean, you didn't have access to a lot of,
The food was
imports and
very
stuff,
good.
yeah.
And we used to joke that nobody got sick except when they went to Chicago House.
That's brilliant.
If you walked into the kitchen in that house, you didn't want to look. It was filthy and greasy. Nobody ever got sick. The first day we arrived, we got there midday, and they produced lunch, and they produced wonderful spaghetti, and we all chowed down the spaghetti. Then they brought the main course. We never went without food. It was tasty, healthy. The modern town of Crusair has a big enough market that they were able to get whatever they wanted. And they did all the shopping. We didn't have to. So that they got stuff. I mean, I'm sure they took a little cut, but they also got it at local prices, so that we saved a lot of money.
And I think you also got some logistical support, like the car from Chicago House, one of the Land Rovers, or if I remember this correctly, somebody told me.
Not while we were at the site, but we did borrow the Land Rover occasionally to go up to Denver to see the inspectors and things like that.
Okay.
And we got assistance from one of the oil companies. Because of the salt spray, the top layer of earth had turned to caliche and was rock hard. And one of the oil company heads was interested in archaeology, and we had stopped it and visited them, and they sent down an earth moving machine, and he just shaved the top layer off, and we could dig down.
Great.
So we once again, you're in the right place. At the right time.
Cool. So let's move on to directorship.
Okay.
So, more serious. Well, you're the only woman to ever serve as director of the Oriental Institute. When you became director, I mean, it's quite evident that it was a very different position, I think, to what it's like today. I mean, I think we can all see that. What were your goals going into the directorship?
Well, the Institute had a reputation on campus and in ancient Near Eastern studies for being divisive. Faculty against faculty, the Egyptologists against the Assyriologists, that sort of thing. And so one of the things I wanted to do was to try to get the people of my generation to work together and not fight among each other. That was one of my main challenges, to avoid personality clashes, to build up individual programs, but still build up the whole institute as a whole. And one of the first things I did was, at the first meeting of the voting members, I handed out a copy of the budget and said, here's where we stand, let's go through it so that you can all understand what's going on and what the financial limitations are, and then we can talk about what we can do about it. And I would like to think that people understood a little bit more what the limitations on what could be done, simply because they now had a little bit more information.
What do you feel were the most important needs at the time when you took up the directorship position?
I think a bit of transparency of what was going and to try to have some feeling of support for individual faculty research, but also for various projects that were going on. And something like the CAD had funding and so on, but other things felt like they weren't getting their fair share. And so I think it was pretty much just to try to make sure that everybody felt like they were understood and what their needs were appreciated, and we were doing our best. And I'm sure I didn't succeed in all of that, but that's what I felt was important to do.
I think it's interesting that I'm just kind of curious, I've thought about this a lot in terms of the director's job and how you intercede in, let's say, faculty quarrels or exactly what you're talking about, where sort of some faculty are seen as difficult, or across campus we're not interacting very well. So I'm just would be curious for more details on how do you go about doing that. I'm not looking for specific names or anything, but I'm more thinking about, so one thing that you're talking about is transparency, which I think is really important, but do you sort of tell people, hey, we're on the same team, like how?
I think one of the first things I did was to try to talk to every faculty member and find out where they were coming from, what they wanted, what they could offer, just to make everybody feel like they were part of the OI, part of the team, and that we could all try to work together. And I'm not the kind of person who has grand schemes, but I think my grand scheme was simply to try to interact with everybody on a regular basis and make sure everybody understood what was going on, and figure out ways that we can try to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. And sometimes it works, sometimes it didn't.
Did you ever have to ask somebody to knock it off?
Yes.
Just curious.
Well, during your 6 years of directorship, what sort of innovations did you actually wanted to make? What worked, what didn't work?
I saw this question on here, and I really don't. It's one of the few things for which I have nothing written down here. As I said, I'm not the kind of person who tries to take over and redirect things and so on. So that I didn't have a big overarching plan. My plan really was to try to facilitate what other people wanted. And to the extent that some of these projects are still going and are getting finished, I guess I didn't do too badly. I'm sure there are others that didn't get going that would have been useful, but there wasn't any stamp that I wanted to try to put on the OI. I wanted to be sort of a caretaker who encouraged my colleagues.
But I also think, just from what you're describing and from what I've read in the director's correspondence, that flattening of a hierarchy is pretty innovative in some ways. Not that
well, if you go back to Breasted, hierarchy was very important.
Yes, and that you need that authoritative figure, or someone taking responsibility for the institute, but to really try to bridge all of those gaps and to bring people together is, when you look at corporations or other institutions, that is innovative at the time, and even now. Sort of like a startup mentality.
It's just who I am. It's the way I work, and so it wasn't something that I consciously said, okay, this is what we're going to do. But yeah, that's probably what one of the results was. Is I don't see any need for major hierarchies and so on that everybody work together.
So now that we're nearing almost 100 years of the Oriental Institute, how do you feel the role of the directorship has changed? Or
well, when you start with the James Henry Breasted, you as soon as you lose him, you've lost a flamboyant entrepreneur, an exceedingly fine scholar who is also capable of dealing with the general public. There are very few people who can do that, and we've had directors along the way who've done bits and pieces of what Breasted did, but nobody will ever be able to do everything that he did. One of the major changes that I see in recent years is the the reason that I refused to take a third term was that they were pushing the full fundraising responsibilities onto the directors of individual entities. And that's not me. I'm just not good at it. I had Gretel Braidwood, who was my assistant, who was very good at it, and so she was able to keep us afloat. And I showed up when I had to, but I'm just not comfortable doing that kind of thing. And when it became more a larger part of the job, I just said, no, there's no point. Let's find somebody who's more willing and interested in doing that sort of thing. And I think that continues to be the case, that so much of the time of the director is spent on fundraising and so on. It's changed but it's changed it back to something that was true of Breasted in the first place. So that it's not a change from the beginning, but it's a change from the middle, perhaps. The other thing I think is the increase of the amount of administration that we see in the university as a whole and that we see in the OI. Some of it is a result of federal government requirements that this be handled and that be handled, and some of it is just a growth of administration. And I personally don't think that it's a positive change, but
so when you were a director, were there that many like staff people, like from the finances to development to publications? I don't know. There's like the whole front office area.
I had Gretel as membership secretary and fundraiser, and a man named David Baird who was administrative assistant, and a woman who was the Mariana who
secretary to the director, assistant to the director.
She wasn't my secretary because I did all my own correspondence and stuff, but she handled questions in the office and all of these things. We hired a person. There had been a woman in the publications office and she retired and we replaced her. Who else did we have? But not as many as we have now.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. I guess you said something about this already, but just you've been in Hyde Park and at the University of Chicago for some time, so it's a unique perspective, and it might be just interesting if we just give a couple anecdotes about how it's changed, either just geographically and culture-wise, from those moments of walking across the
One of the things that was interesting
to now.
when we would go to the field, we'd be gone for 3 months and we'd come back and expect some changes, and there were never any changes. You walk down the street and it looked the same. Now there are a lot of changes. There's been a lot of building of restaurants and businesses and so on 53rd Street and elsewhere. There's been building of apartment buildings and so on. So that physically Hyde Park, not the core, but the periphery of Hyde Park now looks rather different. But in a way, it still hasn't changed. It's still the university atmosphere still dominates, and the one of the claims to fame of Hyde Park is still the lectures on campus, the concerts on campus, the movies that are shown on campus, the opportunities for things to do that pull one to the campus itself, so that it's still a campus-oriented community.
I seem to remember you told me a while ago that when you were a student, the winters were so horribly cold that you guys were like moving from one door to another.
This was one famous winter, which was bitter cold, and I was living in a dorm, I think, where the business school is now. And we were invited to a party on 53rd Street. And so a bunch of us bundled up as much as we could, and we walked about a block and ducked into a doorway and warmed up, and we'd walk another block. But we were 22 years old.
What dorm did you live in as an undergraduate?
It was called New Dorms.
It was called.
Okay. And was it where Woodward or Booth?
It was Woodward. It was Woodward, yeah.
Okay. Is there an institution
in Hyde Park that you really enjoy that has always been here? Like Jimmy's,
Outside of the
I'm
university?
thinking. Yeah, I'm thinking like somewhere like Jimmy's or.
We used to go to Jimmy's, but I haven't been there in years. So. Darwin used to play chess in Jimmy's every Sunday afternoon. They had chess boards and people would play chess, which is a nice local institution.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to give you a pass on that.
That's fine.
I'm
Here's
just
something.
loving how academic it is. Like everyone's like, well, the library, the university. That part. I love it.
Okay, so what is the most, and you might not have an answer, but what is the most apocryphal story about the
I can't come up with an answer for either of those questions.
No.
No.
Okay.
I'm
Something
not a good
circulating
storyteller.
that you've heard and you're like, what? That never
One of my favorite stories, and it doesn't come under either of these headings, but it's one of my favorite
Okay.
stories.
Mhm.
I read two stories of them. One, the Oriental Institute has, as you know, evening members lectures. And there was somebody giving a lecture, and George Hughes and his wife, and Charles Nims and his wife, invited a couple of students to dinner at the Quad Club before that. And so we went over, and they were both wonderful storytellers. And the students who were there just egged them on, and they told story after story. And once one of them told a story, then the other one had to tell a better story, then the first one had to tell a better story. And we never got to the lecture that night. We just sat at the Quad Club listening to this. And about a third of the way through the evening, I'm saying, I wish I had my tape recorder.
Yeah.
I didn't have. But one of the stories they tell, and I don't know whether it was that evening or some other evening, was that the Queen of the Belgians came to Chicago House, and they took her to Medina Tabo to show her the work and so on. And she got into one of the chairs and was hoisted up. And she was rocking back and forth, and they're standing at the bottom and spread your legs, Your Majesty. Still. And they said, we're so embarrassed.
That's brilliant.
Those are good stories. I don't have stories, I'm sorry.
Anne's regretting putting these on there now.
Need a record.
Now it's recorded forever.
So what do you really want to accomplish with what's left of your career? What are the big things where you're thinking, I really want to get this done? I know, like, for some of us, we've always been thinking about the Demotic Chronicle edition that was started years ago. and things like that.
But there are editions of the Demotic Chronicle
Yeah.
now. I would like to see a transformation of the dictionary into a database, searchable database. I don't know whether this is going to be possible because there aren't that many people who want to give money for building databases at this point. We've talked with Chris about it and about the general need for support for ongoing online projects in general, archaeological projects, language projects, whatever. But basically, that's going to be Brian's call, and he's now the associate director, but he will take over whenever he feels like it, and he'll be in charge of moving on. So I don't really have to worry about that. And the other project that I'm working on right now is this source book on women in ancient Egypt for the SBL series. I'd like to see that get done and out, but beyond that, I've got little things that I'd like to finish off, but I don't have any other major projects.
Nothing, no
There's nothing lingering in the back of my mind that I wish I always got.
update of our verbal system or.
No, I mean, there are individual things that I will probably do, but I don't have any other major projects that I'm wishing I could do.
Sure. Speaking of that, actually, it's something that I wanted to ask, and we didn't really talk about it, and I can tie it into your work on the verbal system. One thing I'm wondering, in your book, it's sort of really the first time, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, where Pulaski, his paradigm is sort of applied to Demotic.
Yeah, I think so.
Where somebody sort of takes what he was doing in, late 40s, 50s, 60s.
Ronald Williams had done a little bit.
Okay. So was there
on a limited scale, but
was that something that was already here, where was Hughes and other people saying, this is the sort of paradigm that you should use, or was this something that was consciously where you thought, oh, I want to do something new?
It was, as I was learning Middle Egyptian, it was the new theory, and John Wilson said, I'm too old, I'm not going to learn this new theory, which is fine. Klaus was trying to incorporate it, and then when Ed came back from Chicago House, he also. So it was sort of the accepted way of doing it. George himself probably couldn't have cared less.
Interesting.
He had no objection to my
Right.
doing it that way, but I don't think,
So he didn't see it as like
he didn't see it as a big
a
deal.
source of great insight or anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, interesting. And so, likewise with that, there's been some times in your career, thinking of at least one article in particular, where you've really gone outside of Egyptology and imported theory from other fields. I'm thinking about linguistics in this case. And in fact, you discussed Chomsky a little bit in your article. You're sort of borrowing generative grammar, or however you want to envision that at the time. And I'm just curious how these larger intellectual developments have influenced parts of your career like that, or how important you think they are or aren't, depending on how you see that. I mean, I think you were sort of, other people have been doing this, obviously, and Jim Allen, your other student colleague at the time, has been very interested in this regard, but I think it's a fairly early use of that.
I did it early on, and I still believe that it's worth doing. But especially within linguistics, but probably in other fields as well, there are so many branches of it now that you can't keep up with all of them, and it's easier just to ignore them.
Right.
We did a review of the OI many years ago, and one of the things that sort of came out was that someone like Bob Adams or Bob Brakewood like to look at the big picture, but many of our colleagues, including me, are more interested in trying to get the facts put together, get the details put together, and let someone else deal with the big picture. And that one of the reasons that the OI has a reputation for sound scholarship is that we don't go from one, to use, you can see my attitude by the terminology I'm going to use, we don't flip from one fad to another.
Sure.
And I think that can be seen as a strength of the OI. It also is a limiting factor. And so I encourage students who try to have a theory that they're using when they're working on their dissertation, so that they're not just satisfied with putting together a bunch of facts.
Right. But what was your motivation originally? Why start looking at Chomsky? I mean,
when I did my dissertation, I had Jean Gregg on my committee, and
okay.
I tried to do some linguistics working with him.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That he would sort of pull you in that direction a little bit. Okay, interesting. All right. Do you guys have other questions?
This is a frivolous question in some ways, but I'm kind of curious because when you're talking about field work and how important it is to sort of see where your texts have come from, just in the looking ahead, section of our questions, I'm just curious, is there a place in your imagination that you have not yet gone to in person that you would still like to see related to your work?
A physical place?
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to go to Nubia and Sudan, just because it's a neglected part of our work. The first course I taught when I started teaching was a course on Egyptian New Kingdom texts having to do with Nubia. And it's always been an interest for me. And I keep trying to persuade the OI that we need to have a Nubian specialist. I haven't gotten very far.
Well,
Otherwise, there are so many places in Egypt that I haven't been. I would love to have a year to just wander around.
I think they can, crowbar you into a Sudan trip.
It seems to be
It should be
possible.
possible.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Jan, for taking the
You're
time to
very
do
welcome.
this, and Nadine for being here and helping us
Well,
with
thank
this.
you, this
and
is great.
Thank Anne for organizing it,
Thank you.
Knut for running all of our AV. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube or another OI social media channel, be sure to like or subscribe to those channels, and you'll see a lot more content like this. So thank you.